Making an animated film is enormously time-consuming, even with today's amazing computer power. For a computer-animated film, every character, every prop, and every detail of every set has to be built, coloured, and made to work before any animation can begin. And it all starts with pencil and paper. Here's the drawing of Queenie the Quail from It's a Boy. This picture was scanned into the computer and then used as a template to build the 3D model of Queenie. Once she was formed, she needed to be given her colours. To do that, the mesh that was used to make her was unwrapped, and this flat texture was then painted to fit onto the mesh. Since It's a Boy was made to look like a cartoon, Queenie's texture was very simple. Textures in Zooroom will be much more complicated. Have a look at Ten's chest piece here. The unwrapped mesh looks like this, and the surface textures have to be painted to fit. Watch how each layer builds up the final surface. First there's the colour, then the varying brightness of the surface, then the strength of the highlights, the width of the highlights, and the reflectivity. There! Now that looks like an old metal surface.
Are you saying I look old?
Well, yes. No. I think I'll get back to Queenie.
Good idea.
Well, the model of Queenie was looking all right, but it didn't do anything. To make it possible to animate her, she had to have a skeleton made inside her, and the mesh had to be fixed to the skeleton in a process known as skinning. This took quite a long time, because the influence of each skeletal joint had to be adjusted so that she bent in the right way without folding up or looking lumpy. The controls were then made to work the skeleton. Some of these were fairly simple, and others, like the wing controls, were very complicated. Here are the 148 lines of code that had to be written to make sure the wing feathers moved properly with the wing and didn't interfere with one another. As you can see, it worked nicely. Lastly, for characters who had to talk, all the mouth positions and other facial movements had to be modelled and applied as what are called blend shapes. For Queenie, this involved making 19 copies of her and then modifying each one to show, say, an eyebrow raised or the beak making a W shape. After this, she was finally ready to be animated. So, how do we get from the script to the final finished animation? Well, first of all, the voices were recorded so that the animators could time the mouth movements of the characters to the actor's speech.
A lot of people think the animation is done first, but that would be much more difficult.
Oh, yes, all right, I was just coming to that. A lot of people think the animation is done first, but that would be much more difficult. This way around, the animators can base their character's performance on the way the actors deliver their lines, and it allows the actors to give their own interpretation of the script, even to ad lib sometimes. All right?
All right.
After that, it was all back to pencil and paper. Working from the script and the sound recordings, the director and the storyboard artists made a kind of strip cartoon of the film, drawing every shot so that they could decide how the film was going to run. Once they were happy with the storyboard, it was then taken to the layout artist, who put the computer model characters into the sets and positioned the cameras and all the models for each shot. Most of the decisions about when to change shot and how long each shot would last were made in these two stages. Then the animation began. The characters were posed into one position and a key frame was recorded. The time slider was then moved on to the place where the next pose had to be, and the character was positioned again and key-framed. This was done in several stages, starting with the basic movement like the flapping of these wings, and then refining it until the motion flowed properly. Here's the finished flying motion for Queenie. Mouth positions and facial expressions were added to match the voice recordings. In It's a Boy, the characters were animated without their clothes. and then a cloth simulation program was used to make the clothes move realistically with the bodies. Finally, the scene was lit in much the same way as for live-action films and prepared for rendering. Rendering is the process of making film frames out of the data that's in the computer. This takes an enormous amount of computing power. Pixar say that they took about 6 hours to render one single frame of film for Toy Story or Ratatouille. Cinema films run at 24 frames a second, so you can imagine how long it could take to render a whole film. To speed things up, many computers are linked together in what is called a render farm. For It's a Boy, the output frames were then assembled into movie files, which were edited together to make the final film. Then the sound effects were added into the soundtrack, and the music score was written and recorded. And with all those processes complete, the film was ready to be shown.
Oi, that's enough of that, please. Oi.
Out you go. Come on, out you go.
Was that all right?
Yes, I think so. Although...
Although what?
Well, you could have mentioned that to render one frame, the computer has to take measurements of each of 2 million pixels at least 9 times. That's 18 million measurements for each frame. With 24 of those for every second of film, that's 432 million measurements per second, 25,920,000,000 per minute, and 2,332,800,000,000 measurements for the whole film.
Oh. Do you think we should do it all again?